First of all, welcome. My name is John O'Sullivan. For the benefit of people who will be watching this on the screens, I'm the president of the Danube Institute, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome the audience here and the audience outside for a lecture on an extremely important topic, one that's highly topical, but also has a great deal of history behind it, which is, of course, the history of pandemics and how they affect human societies, both at the time and subsequently. It's my great pleasure to say that the lecture will be delivered by Dr. Calum Nicholson. Now, Dr. Nicholson is a distinguished academic, holder of a PhD from Cambridge University and of many other positions in academic life. He's a fellow at the Danube Institute here in Budapest, and we're delighted to say that he's just agreed to sign on for a longer period. He's an anthropologist, and anthropology is a topic that illuminates not only the societies that we call primitive, but also, of course, our own societies, which in many respects retain primitive features, but which actually are interesting because when those sophisticated, they often revert to rather primitive aspects under crisis. Is this one of those occasions? We've been living for a time under conditions of pandemic, both the pandemic itself and of the measures designed to limit it. And those measures have been dramatic. Our lives have all changed in significant ways. We don't go out as much. We have to be masked a lot of the time. Sometimes we are asked to stay at home for long periods without going out. We work from home. And of course, we sometimes find ourselves having to return home or not go out at all because of curfews. Now, this is a very different kind of life to the one that we've been living for the last, well, I would say really, let us say since the end of the Cold War, when society visibly relaxed in all kinds of ways, and which has meant that we have become, in a sense, relaxed ourselves. And for the last 2 years, we have not been allowed to be relaxed. And we're becoming, a lot of us would feel, a little more Prussian than we really want to be, or we have been before. I saw the other day that the German police are now actually carrying measuring rods to make sure that people are actually standing the right numbers of meters away from each other in the crowd, which is both very thorough and Germanic, but at the same time strikes one as a little silly too. When the police move into a crowd to measure how far we are standing from the person next to us. And it's something which would have excited ridicule, I think, until 2 years ago. The fact that it doesn't do so now is itself important. Now, that's a very trivial example, you may think. But if our lives are changing, and if they're changing in trivial ways, they're almost certainly changing in serious ways as well that we're not perhaps always aware of. Well, we're in the hands of somebody who knows how these things have happened in the past and is, I think, well qualified to tell us, forecast perhaps, what may happen in the future, and I think has the common sense as well as the knowledge to give us good advice on how to deal with both those circumstances. So Calum, thank you very much for coming here. Thank you for giving this lecture. I look forward eagerly to what you have to say.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, is that better here or here? Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you to everyone for coming. So today, I'm going to be talking on the topic of culture in crisis, what the COVID-19 pandemic and its handling reveals about the West and its prospects. So as we all know, it's now been almost 2 years since we first heard reference to something called a coronavirus. I remember hearing reference to it for the first time, I think in late December 2019, perhaps early January 2020. Needless to say, since then, we've seen and experienced a great deal, most of which would have been unimaginable at the time, at least in Western culture. There has, of course, been the rapid spread and waves of the disease itself. We've seen people we know and love get ill, and in most cases recover, and in a relatively small number of cases die. All of this seemed unimaginable before in the contemporary West, something that was confined to our past or others' present. I remember how inconceivable it seemed when I first heard tell of it, that society in the quiet bit of rural England where I lived might eventually be disrupted by something happening in urban China. But what was unimaginable in late 2019, and which has since come to pass, extends far beyond the advent and nature of the disease. Indeed, the most remarkable and startling, and I think ultimately most consequential things, are less to do with the disease itself, and more to do with how we, as a society, have reacted to it, and through this, what it has revealed about the nature of Western society in general. There is an old adage that someone's true character is revealed in a crisis. We discover who we or others are under pressure. But the same logic can, in fact, or at least I would argue, be extended to societies as a whole. In the last 2 years, we have certainly been a culture in crisis. This, though, I think can have two meanings. On the one hand, we have been a culture attempting to handle a public health crisis, but on the other, I would argue, in how we've handled it, we have actually revealed a culture that is itself in crisis, a culture that has some character flaws that the crisis itself has revealed. Many would, of course, view the pandemic as something of a public health apocalypse, a cataclysm that has severely disrupted our lives and in some cases ended them. However, what is often forgotten is that the word apocalypse, in fact, has two meanings. The modern meaning is indeed cataclysm, but not many people seem to know that the original meaning of the word apocalypse meant the revelation of what had previously been concealed. And it would seem to me that the pandemic has been both sorts of apocalypse simultaneously, both a public health cataclysm, but also a revelation that our culture and politics are ill-equipped to respond to such a crisis with any of the qualities that the West, at least, has long presumed itself to embody: dispassion, reason, proportion, pragmatism, realism, calm, and open and good faith discussion. What I'd therefore like to do in this talk is discuss less the science, the epidemiology, and the virology of the disease itself, but instead the other half of the story, the social and political and the cultural side. For the debate on the pandemic, I think, has been notable for how little notice this side has really received. In saying that the pandemic has revealed a culture in crisis, what I want to specifically do is explore how it has revealed that our relationship to the world around us, our institutions, the culture, each other, is not what we perhaps previously thought. Specifically, I'm thinking of our relationship to our key institutions, be it to science, government, the economy, and the media. But I'm also thinking of our relationship to the past, to the future, to each other, and fundamentally to ourselves. In doing this, my purpose is to help us consider how we might approach revisions in our thinking and our culture once this crisis has passed. How can we best plan to think as individuals and as a society in its wake? How can we think so that in future we are less vulnerable to such crises and more able to organize ourselves to confront them? And how can we make sure we do not react to sudden crises in ways that, far from solving our problems, risk becoming part of the problem we need to solve? So to begin, I first want to discuss the relationship between science and society and the problem that the COVID crisis has revealed and how we, as a society, understand our relationship to science. I should, however, make a few disclaimers so I'm not misinterpreted. So to point out what I think should be obvious, COVID is real and vaccines are helpful. There may be questions about whether the virus emerged from nature or escaped from a lab, and I suspect the latter personally, but that does not remotely suggest it was intentional. If so, accidents happen. I further believe that both the virology and the epidemiology of COVID, the study of the virus and the study of how it spreads in populations, has been excellent. The entire pandemic has shown science at its best and shown what is possible when we coordinate and dedicate sufficient resources to addressing a disease. However, while the science has generally been good, the problem comes when we extend beyond the study of the nature of the disease and how it spreads, and instead begin to consider the appropriate policy responses and cultural changes required to contain and curtail it. This problem is captured in the general assumption that has lain at the heart of the public and especially policy and political response to the pandemic. That is, the assumption that the solutions to the pandemic are ones that only scientists can legitimately speak about. I've been really struck in the last 21 months by how few voices there are questioning the dominant narrative about the nature of and necessary response to the pandemic. With the notable exception of Lord Sumption, in the UK it has mainly been left to provocateurs and professionally partisan writers and columnists to do so. This, I think, is bad for the public discourse, as it has the effect of politicizing what really should be an apolitical debate. There have been basically two problems with the public understanding of science. First, and as with discussions of climate change, there has been an erroneous assumption that the science is monolithic. But this is not how science works, especially in the sciences that depend on modeling and projections, as it does when we discuss COVID and climate change. There are potentially as many models with their subjectively selected and defined inputs as there are epidemiologists. Scientists themselves know this. Their field is built on the creative tension of such aspective diversity. But somehow, to the general public, the perception remains that science is monolithic. There are, in fact, few areas of science that are so conclusive that there is no room for questioning. Even in fundamental physics, there is room for debate. To challenge the scientific consensus is not heresy. Rather, it is simply, by definition, to show that there is not, in fact, a consensus at all. And furthermore, real science is not threatened by challenge. Rather, it encourages it. The criteria of good science, after all, is not whether its conclusions can be verified, but whether they can be falsified. That is, whether it is possible to establish an experiment by which one might prove the claims of science false, if indeed this is what they are. For science, friction, that is, respectful disagreement, is a source of illumination. Second, and again as with discussions of climate change, there is the problem of assuming that science may be a guide to policy, with the implication that the scientific facts ought to, and indeed can, dictate our culture and our values. This is the problem of what philosophers of science call scientism. If science, proper science, is a tool for use, scientism refers to when we think science isn't just a tool to use, but a guide to the fundamental ethical truths that can inform that use. In a sense, real science is simply a tool, with its relationship to society being analogous to a hammer's relationship to a house. We use hammers to build a house, but a hammer cannot guide us in making a home. There are objective truths about how to engineer houses that will not collapse, as there are about the nature, there's objective truths about the nature of COVID. But the question of what we want the house we engineer to look like is not an objective, but a subjective one. It is a reflexive question about ourselves, not simply one about the material world. That is the only thing science can really talk about with any authority. And so it is when we begin to consider not simply the nature of COVID, but the nature of, and so it is when we begin to consider not simply the nature of COVID, but the nature of the society we want to live in while we deal with COVID. As with the discussion of climate change, when we discuss COVID, the discussion of the science, the virology, the epidemiology, is no more than half the discussion, and indeed is only, I think, really the easy half, ending before all the really tricky questions and problems begin tricky because they are inherently subjective societal ones rather than objective scientific ones. Because, again, as with climate change, the reason we care about COVID is because of its presumed consequence for society. For, and again, as with climate change, tackling COVID requires us to consider new trade-offs and new compromises. We need not only consider which epidemiological model to believe, but once one is chosen, we then need to consider two things. First, the best policy for responding to the disease, let it run its course, to engage in focused isolation of the most vulnerable, namely the old, the infirm, and especially the old who are infirm, or to lock down entire populations, regardless of their vulnerability to the disease. And then once we have chosen a policy, and overwhelmingly governments worldwide chose blanket lockdowns following the example of China, the origin of the disease, but also an authoritarian dictatorship, we then faced a second question of how to strike the right balance between a concern for public health in a very narrowed area of COVID and a concern for every other element and aspect and problem we face in society. This includes, of course, our concern for other pathologies, be they biological, psychological, or social. It is clear that in closing doctors' offices and delaying cancer screenings, many other diseases have gone diagnosed, and that in locking down and isolating people, we've seen an explosion in domestic violence, alcoholism, and depression and self-harm. And this is before we come to the trade-offs between lives and livelihoods, which I'll come back to. All these questions, these weighing of trade-offs, simply are not questions science can answer, because they are fundamentally reflexive, philosophical, and cultural ones about who we are and what we value, about our priorities and our subjective views of what is and what is not an acceptable risk. In short, we realize there is more to these problems than simply the objective facts of science. Questions of value are subjective and demand political debate, not a polite consensus. Science can serve politics and subjective values, but it cannot dictate or reveal what those values should be. Over the last few decades, we've seen the steady encroachment of this sort of scientism throughout the culture of the West. Again, this scientism is the presumption that science isn't just a method or a tool, but a philosophy and an ethics in and of itself. But in this crisis, we are seeing the cost of this fallacy, whereby we think science is not just a tool for particular use, but a guide to more total and totalizing truth. Above all else, this crisis and its aftermath has revealed the need, I think, to rejuvenate our faith in philosophy, of keeping an eye on context, on the bigger picture, on the whole subjective organism of society, rather than simply its more objective and mechanical and scientifically legible parts. We constantly hear the lament that people and politicians are ignorant of the science. For the most part, this is true. But it is hardly more surprising than that most people are ignorant of most areas of law, and hardly more problematic. Science and law are specialized areas of knowledge, and in their devilish detail, rather dry. Why would, and why indeed should, people keep up with it all? How indeed could they? What seems to me much more consequential is not ignorance of scientific facts, for everyone is ignorant to some extent. The last true polymath probably lived in the 18th century. Rather, the most consequential thing, I think, is having far too much reverence for science, in the sense of assuming it is monolithic and alone able to guide us in a crisis such as this. I suspect we'll look back at the pandemic as a time in which we realized, the hard way and perhaps too late, that there is a difference between society being served by a science that is cautious, plural, and which knows its place as a tool playing a useful part in service of a broader societal whole, and we'll learn the difference between that and being enthralled to technocratic scientism, a scientism which is convicted, monolithic, and myopic in its hubris, and hubristic in its myopia. But of course, the reason that the encroachment of scientism into our lives is a problem is because it is implied in what most of our governments have been doing. And thus, we've seen them repeatedly declare that they do not reason for themselves, but instead have outsourced to the scientists the difficult questions and the hard thinking about the most judicious and balanced policy responses to the pandemic. This has had the effect of at once de-philosophizing and depoliticizing the policymaking process, which has the effect of, in the final analysis, also dehumanizing it too. This political maneuver, which acts to strain the obvious politics from the decision-making process, has had the surely intentional effect of disguising the fact that the decision to lock down whole populations, rather than enacting targeted and indeed well-funded isolation of the vulnerable, was not a scientific one at all, but an inherently political one. It is a maneuver that reeks of the cynical politics of minimizing electoral risk at the ballot box at, quite literally, all costs. And it is simultaneously a politics which has not only constituted the least electoral risk to the political parties in power, and in the UK, both of our major parties have the same perspective, or seeking power, but also it has wildly increased what governments are able, and indeed now expected, to do. In locking us all down, they have set a dangerous precedent for the state intervening in all our lives. The justification has been that we are in a state of crisis. This was the same reasoning, of course, that led to the Patriot Act after 9/11 in the United States, an act which encroached on civil liberties and expanded surveillance of private individuals. And it is the same reasoning we see in the calls for government climate action, intervening in and imposing laws upon ordinary people's lives. But even compared to these, lockdowns have been extreme. There seems to, in fact, be little widespread awareness of just how unprecedented this policy of house arrest has been. And house arrest is what so-called lockdowns, in fact, are, of course. Lockdown was, in the UK at least, initially rolled out not by law, but by decree, before any law was passed. Once the law was passed, it was often interpreted by the police in a manner that went far beyond what the law itself allowed for. Furthermore, what was written in law was, in fact, unprecedented in British history. In the words of one analyst, even in wartime, there has been no equivalent of the order to make it a criminal offense for people to meet each other and to remain in their homes other than for specified reasons. Even Parliament seems rather indifferent to this. On the 11th of October, 2 months ago, 2 committees of the UK House of Commons, the Health and Social Care and Science and Technology Committees, released a report with the title Coronavirus, Lessons Learned to Date. According to Noah Carl, the report takes for granted that lockdown was the right policy, and in fact argues that Britain should have locked down earlier in March of 2020. It further made, quote, no attempt to evaluate the scientific evidence of lockdown efficiency, and gave no consideration to focus protection as an alternative strategy, and showed, quote, no interest in weighing up the total costs and benefits of lockdown. The following words did not even appear in the report at all: cost-benefit analysis, collateral damage, civil liberties, focused protection. What therefore has been revealed through the crisis is just how easy it is for government to set new precedents for intrusion into our lives, and just how little resistance or even discomfort this raises in the general population. For those of us who believe in the liberal part of being in a liberal democracy, it is a concerning development. When we talk of lockdowns, of course, there are 2 things at issue: the reason for locking down, to protect us from COVID, and the externalities of locking down, that is, the effect on the normal rhythm of our lives. This rhythm can be expressed and framed in numerous ways, many of which I'll go on to discuss in this talk. But perhaps the major and most measurable one is what we term the economy. And I think in arguing for locking down, we've seen a rather naive contempt or taking for granted of the economy, attitudes that betray, I think, a huge and consequential mistake in precisely what we mean when we talk about the economy. We have often in the pandemic heard variations on the idea that life matters more than the economy. But this phrase implies that we've forgotten what exactly the economy refers to. The economy is not some luxury or affectation or indulgence of the rich, The economy is simply the name we give the quantitative abstraction of people's lives as they live them. It is a phrase that, rather crudely, tries to approximate, mechanically theorize, and quantitatively value a part of something that is in truth organic, whole, and qualitative. That is the experience of life itself. We must all eat and sleep and find shelter. We work collectively to do this. Part of this collective effort is what we term the economy. The economy has another name, livelihoods. To juxtapose lives in the economy doesn't sound nearly as absurd as lives to livelihoods. So this is a false dichotomy, for the economy is not some abstract structure that sits apart from life. Saying it is a matter of life versus the economy is as absurd as saying it is a matter of life versus life. The debate here is not between the forces of morality and venality. It is between different and equally important and valid understandings of what the grounds for moral action is. And perhaps the problem is that when people think of the economy, they are actually thinking of finance. And remember the venality that led to the banking crisis in 2008. All finance may be reducible to the economy, but of course not all the economy is reducible to finance. And as with so much in our fevered political culture in recent years, in the wake of this crisis, we might all do with reflecting on our rhetoric. For in this case, the mantra of lives over the economy, that is the paradoxical dismissal of livelihoods and the effort to ensure no life is dismissed, is actually quite dangerous. It is a rhetoric that has led, I think, to a deafening silence on whether livelihoods are in fact something that can be dismissed or taken for granted. Recently, it was announced that the UK is set to shrink 14% this year, and unemployment may double to 9%. This is not an abstraction. This is potentially as much of a cataclysm for life as the disease itself, and potentially in the long term far more so. Thus, through the pandemic, we've seen a misperception of science and scientists as omniscient guides to how we ought to live, a cynical use of this narrative by governments, and a warped sense of what we mean by the economy. But behind and indeed woven into all this has been a fundamentally flawed or at least skewed frame of reference, a belief that we are all seriously threatened by the disease, which has led again, in the words of Noah Carl, to levels of personal fear being strikingly mismatched to objective risk of death. As he provocatively writes, people overestimating the risk of COVID is a much bigger problem than people assuming it's just the flu. The vector for this fear has, of course, been the mainstream media, which has arguably engaged with the science as if it is both monolithic and a guide to action, and further failed to rigorously and dispassionately scrutinize government policy, the mantra that lives matter more than the economy, or point out when the government has moved the goalposts in perpetuating lockdown policies. Examples of when governments have moved the goalposts are quite easy to find. In the UK, the original and stated purpose of lockdown was to push down the curve in order to allow time for hospitals to raise their preparedness and or to spread the impact on hospitals. In either case, the goal was not to protect people from ever contracting COVID, but rather to ensure there were always enough ventilators to save those people who could have been saved by such ventilators. The goal was to avoid excess deaths who could have been saved. Yet in the end, hospitals did not expand that dramatically and remained fearful of any later surge. Some countries even adopted the goal of zero COVID, a baffling ambition given that it is a global pandemic, meaning that once borders were opened again, then the disease would return anyway, as it repeatedly has. We've seen little real scrutiny or even questioning of these sorts of decisions, and the media has been particularly poor at pointing out when the goalposts have been quietly moved. All this is what the mainstream media has not done, but there are also dispiriting things it has been doing. Chief among these is driving the politicization of the debate on the proportionality of lockdowns. That's probably the core thing that the media has been doing. One would think that discussing the proportionality of lockdowns would be an apolitical activity, that everyone has an interest in a dispassionate, good faith debate. And yet, and as with the climate debate with its so-called believers and deniers, The COVID debate has similarly divided into two caricatured camps. Indeed, as soon as the politically polarizing figure of Donald Trump expressed doubt about the proportionality of lockdowns, it instantly tarred anyone anti-lockdown as a Trumpist. It then became nearly impossible to find or explore nuance in the debate. All this was drearily predictable, everything reflecting the polarization that is so typical of our politics in the social media age. We see this polarization everywhere, of course. And while polarization is not new, what is new is the form it takes as we sink deeper into our social media echo chambers. Where once in a pre-digital age we usually had to all reconcile our different perspectives with the same facts, now with social media siloing people into entirely separate epistemic communities and sources of information, we each believe now that we have our own facts rather than opinions upon the facts. Logically, we therefore believe the other camp is made up not simply of people with different subjective perspectives, but of people who are objectively wrong. By extension, we assume they are either lying or being manipulated by liars. As such, the pandemic has revealed how problematic our relationship to the media establishment is. We knew this before, but we are now seeing the true cost of this, as it has endorsed and encouraged actions which are immolating our economies, eroding accountability in government, and furthering the sense that scientists are a form of secular priesthood. Where priests were once seen as having exclusive access to the mind of God, these new robed priests in the white coats are held to have a privileged access to the truths of life itself. Far from pushing back against these worrying cultural trends, the media would appear to be embracing and accelerating them. So we can see how the pandemic has revealed how our relationship to science, government, the economy, and the media is far less edifying and far more problematic than we might previously have assumed. However, this is not all the pandemic has revealed. It has also revealed startling disjunctures and disruptions in how we relate to the culture itself and the people who have, do, and indeed will make it up. In the pandemic, we talk about the major variable at issue as being the disease itself. But perhaps it's worth considering another perspective, that our attitudes to risk are at least as consequential. It is worth asking, in our culture, are we perhaps the historical exception in our attitudes towards death and risk and loss? Perhaps we might consider whether, in attempting to preserve the belief, unique to the late 20th and early 21st century, that with the help of science we can control our individual fate, we risk sealing our collective one as an aspirational society. What cost, tangible or intangible, is in the end acceptable to avoid being confronted by our limits as a society and as moral actors? Central to this debate is the status of death in our culture. And central to understanding that status is an understanding of how it has changed and how historically exceptional our current zero tolerance for mortality in fact is. Faced with poverty, war, violent crime, the circle of life and disease, mortality was a constant concern and preoccupation in the lives of even the wealthiest people until the early 20th century. Before sanitation and welfare, before volunteer armies, long-distance ballistics and drones, before Peel's police, before antibiotics, Fleming, and modern midwifery, before epidemiology and microbiology, death was a spectre haunting the lives of everyone. It was in part the very basis of religious faith itself, it being the best defense most people could muster against the vicissitudes of fortune and indeed the ultimate misfortune. It is no coincidence that historically faith contracts as control over our fate dilates. Today, our predominantly secular public culture reflects the general belief that we have replaced fate with fact and a general sense that death has become less a matter of theology, more a matter of technocracy. Whereas in the past, the stories told were of miraculous survival against the odds, today the stories we tell are death against the odds. Where once the exception to be explained away was survival, today the exception to be accounted for is death. Why did it happen? What mistake was made? Who is responsible? In our technocratic, risk-averse culture, we have so systematically inoculated ourselves against risk that death on the road, in the air, at the front, while at work, in the ward, have become a morbid curiosity demanding explanation, that we may identify the error in the cultural code to be corrected so that the death in question is never replicated. But this attitude to death is the historical exception, not the rule, and in this current crisis it is crucial that we realize our attitudes to it are shaped by the exceptional period we have just lived through since the end of the Second World War. Near the beginning of the pandemic, the 65-year-old Maria Shriver, Arnold Schwarzenegger's wife, said that her generation had seen a lot in their lifetimes. But this is true only to a point. The baby boomer generation, those most at risk from this pandemic, have, as a cohort, certainly seen the most of any generation in human history, given their lifelong freedom to travel, access to telecommunications, and longevity. But have they actually experienced the most? Have they experienced pandemics, wars, cataclysms, on par with those that blighted the lives of their parents and their ancestors? I think clearly not. Their attitude to risk has been frozen by fortune, not forged in fire. This idealist frame of reference could have cataclysmic consequences in the current crisis. The pathologizing of death and fetishizing of life in our culture, a culture which glorifies youth over experience, the individual over the collective, longevity over meaning, has led to a deafening silence on the question of whether we should, in fact, be seeking to mitigate the virus at all costs. The focus as a result has been on how to do this. As noted, governments claim to be science-led in their efforts, a claim that implies there is no discussion of values to be had. But ultimately, this is a question of values and philosophy, not science. And what we're learning through this crisis are that many of our age's most exceptional values, individualism, the rule of the market, the globalization of everything, not least supply chains, are in fact exceptional in a much more prosaic sense. They are revealed to be fair weather ideas, interesting ideas for easy times, but in interesting times they are proving to be uneasy ones. And perhaps most uneasy of all is our collective attitude and orthodoxy towards risk. For decades, there's been the gradual and inexorable, some would say viral, spread of risk aversion across the culture. Sector by sector, year by year, the lawyers have shaken their heads and drawn in red ink the circle of acceptability more tightly. In an attempt to limit the quantity of risk, we have seen a great sacrifice across the culture in quality of experience. As the paperwork has grown, and as the concept of liability has entered the calculus of everything we do, we've seen the dwindling of everything from the school field trip to what is acceptable speech, from the time police, teachers, and doctors can dedicate to their primary duties, to the number of people who can afford to set up a new business, still less make a success of them. The current crisis likely marks the end to all these trends, which have increasingly dominated human society for half a century. The emergence of the virus itself undermines the long-term practicality of global outsourcing and supply chains. The collective nature of our vulnerability and mitigation efforts in the face of the outbreak dissolves the figment of the bounded individual. The sudden necessity of the nation-state reveals the market to be no panacea in a pandemic. And taken to its logical extreme, a culture of risk aversion is itself revealed, paradoxically, to be one of the greatest risks we face, with its potential costs being systemic and devastating for both the society and economy, both globally and in the long term. And yet, this culture of risk aversion is what we are living in, and it seems to be as determinative of our actions as the nature of the disease itself. We often hear the term zero COVID, which has echoes of net zero carbon in discussions of climate change. But another way to see this term is that what we're really trying to express is an interest in zero risk, an absurd idea once stated so plainly. This culture of risk aversion, the pathologization of the existence of any risk itself, has become so normalized that we hardly realize how strange it in fact is. But it is there, and as the pandemic has revealed, it is of consequence in a crisis such as the one we've been experiencing. But in revealing we've lost perspective on the past, the pandemic has also perhaps revealed that we're losing perspective on the future. Specifically, we're losing perspective on our obligations to future generations. We fail to see that in indefinitely shuttering the entire economy and closing all schools and suspending virtually all of life as we know it, we might in the long term do more harm than good. It may indirectly and in the long term be killing more people than the virus, similar to how the collapse of the Soviet Union caused a spike in deaths from suicide and stress-induced alcoholism. It is also certainly destroying much of the collective culture and economy and doing vast qualitative and permanent damage to the socioeconomic fabric of society. The thing with the words culture and society themselves is that they are really simply shorthands for describing the rich soil of traditions and norms that we've sedimented over the decades, the centuries, the millennia of culture and of time. Traditions and norms which are the stuff from which new traditions and cultures now can grow. Like trust, which is essentially a essentially a manifestation of, culture takes all of history to build, but it can be lost almost in an instant. And in the pursuit of protecting a minority of a retired generation, who are already the healthiest and longest lived of any in human history, we are genuinely at risk of retiring the very concept of retirement, among other 20th century luxuries, as a norm and expectation for future generations of the majority. The very idea of the modern state-backed pension scheme is in fact a relatively recent invention from the late 19th century. There is now a strong possibility it will no longer be part of the culture by the late 21st. But behind all these revelations about our true relationships to our institutions and the broader culture, there are the most fundamental revelations about how we relate to each other as human beings. The overall narrative of the pandemic has been that lockdowns are justified because they are anchored in a principle of selflessness, of prioritizing the well-being of the society over ourselves. I have always been baffled by this claim, for it seems to me that precisely the opposite could also be argued. In times of war, society tends to send off its healthiest and youngest adults to fight and to risk and often meet death. Why do we do it, and why do we accept it as a society? Because we recognize that we are all part of something bigger than ourselves, which is the culture. Yet with COVID, we have constantly heard the opposite, that there is nothing more important in life than the avoidance of death. We have been told that we must sacrifice our collective culture, our arts, our jobs, our economy, indeed everything qualitative and experiential that is part of life and living, in order to minimize individual deaths. Far from locking down being a selfless act for the greater good, it could seem equally arguable that locking down is a selfish act to the greater collective detriment, particularly when there was the cheaper alternative of targeted protection for the groups who were vulnerable. From a scientific perspective, lockdowns have perhaps been selfless, but from a humanities perspective, from a human rather than a viral perspective, it has arguably been the epitome of a culture of selfishness. But in these actions, what most fundamentally the pandemic has revealed is not only an impoverished technocratic worldview, but I think a deeply shallow and fundamentally warped view of ourselves and of our very nature as human beings. For the whole handling of the pandemic has revealed that we fail to understand that what is most central and important in our lives is not avoiding death, but living life. And that specifically means to live not in isolation, but in a network of relationships. We are, as everyone from evolutionary biologists to psychologists know, the ultimate relational animal. It is no coincidence that solitary confinement is held as the harshest non-corporeal punishment, because people who run prisons know that we are a social animal, and it is a form of invisible torture to isolate someone. Similarly, far from not understanding relationships, sociopaths understand them all too well. They know our need to trust people, to build connection, to see the best in others, and they exploit these tendencies. Society and the economy are merely again simply shorthand abstractions for the networks of relationships that make up not just our activities, but our very sense of self. We gain the words we know, the thoughts we have, the accents we cannot lose, and the very feelings we experience as a consequence of exposure to others. There is an odd paradox of contemporary culture, I find, which is that those who believe themselves to be the publicly good people that is, those trying to improve the world, be it through climate action advocacy or advocating for lockdowns, seem to do so often in a manner that specifically discounts the importance and centrality of relationships in our lives. And yet those that they themselves disparage as heartless because they challenge the orthodoxies around slogans like zero COVID or net zero, often do so precisely because they do understand that such policies risk rending the social fabric, the very tapestry into which we are all in our individual threads woven. And it is worth noting that these flawed priorities of well-meaning people, of denying the centrality of relationships and the qualitative in our lives, and privileging the material and the quantitative, is evident in almost all areas of contemporary society. It is, of course, particularly evident in the admonitions of big business and transnational corporations in general. For years, we've seen our elites in the North American model of capitalism measure value in purely quantitative terms, with little to no regard for the place or role of business in the community. And so, for decades, we've seen elites espouse the virtues of a rational order of moving businesses overseas to save money and damn the social consequences of eviscerating communities of their livelihoods. It's not personal, they'll say, it's business. We must be rational, and by the way, this may not feel just today, but it will be in the long term, they'll say. The market will correct. The market will be a rising tide, and it will lift all boats in time. For the destitute communities in the provinces of England, where I'm from, or in the flyover states, as they're called, the flyover states of the US, it's not clear that time ever, or indeed will ever come, as opioids take their grip in the vacuum of meaning and purpose and dignity in the wake of lost industries. The pandemic has simply revealed the full scale of this sort of misanthropy, this view that everything qualitative and particular in our lives, our traditions, our routines, our relationships, our sense of normality, our loves, and our capacity to cope with loss itself, is discountable and of less importance in removing all risk from life itself. This is a dystopian understanding of human existence, for it sees our lives as a negation, lengths of time in the future, in the service of which all risk must be ironed out, rather than breadths of experience in the present, which necessarily must involve positively stepping into the unknown and taking that risk. Even though we can see so many other distortions that have been revealed through the pandemic, it is this that seems to me most alarming and most personal. Indeed, it is precisely because it is so personal that it is so alarming. So in this discussion of COVID, and as I've already suggested, there are interesting and eerie, and I think very revealing parallels with the public discussion of climate change. Both are seen as existential threats that require us to completely upend our societies or risk mass mortality. Both are issues where science has morphed into scientism, where we've begun to believe that science can be a guide to our values. Both have seen governments claim more moral authority in efforts to control and dictate our lives. Both are ideas that take the economy for granted, assuming it is something in and of itself, both inhumane and cold, and separate from our actual lives, rather than simply an abstraction for describing elements of those lives for institutions. Both have also seen the debate in the public domain politically polarize, a polarization that is both evident in and driven by the media landscape, which is increasingly a vector for governing orthodoxies, rather than a tool by which we may challenge those orthodoxies. Both also ignore the lessons and culture of the past and fail to critically assess our current phobias and moral panics through a comparative historical perspective. Both topics are discussed in light of a stated and presumed empathy for future generations, even while the policies enacted will do more to harm the prospects of future generations than the issues themselves. And while both lockdown policies and calls for climate adaptation and mitigation policies are made in the name of considering the interests of the collective, both are actually, or at least arguably, quite selfish. And both portray a view of life that does not value life and living it free from abstractions and generalities and technocratic oversight and interventions on our lives. Both entail a view of us as things, not people, and discount the intrinsic value and necessary role of non-quantifiable, subjective, and cultural and traditional activity in our lives. It is perhaps no coincidence that we've seen two so similarly structured phenomena in the preoccupations with climate and COVID overwhelm and reorient the general culture in a few short years, arguably the social media age. Indeed, we seem to have now entered an age where the new hysterias and irrationalisms are not ones that are dissolved by science, but rather fueled by a blind faith that science holds all the answers. In fact, we might even argue that scientism is the new faith, and it is Old Testament stuff: fire, brimstone, plagues, and judgment. But as I've argued, science is a tool for use, not an answer to what is true in a general sense of how we ought to live. We need to use it wisely. If we don't, we risk using it, our greatest achievement, as a justification for our manias at the cost of the thing that is most hard won, but so often taken for granted, the rhythm of our normality. After this crisis, hopefully we can continue to respect science, but cease perhaps to act with the breathless deference and scientific reductiveness that has been the growing trend over the last few decades, the cost of which I think is being revealed through this pandemic. The problems I've outlined in this talk were all, of course, trends that existed before the current pandemic crisis, and have simply had their costs thrown into sharper relief by it, in that they are exacerbating the disastrous consequences of a natural hazard in the disease. This apocalyptic revelation is perhaps something that can be leveraged to stimulate broader reflection on the philosophical norms of our prevailing culture with a view to changing them. It would seem to me that not doing so would be the real apocalypse, in the second sense of cataclysm, in the long term. And in the current crisis, it does certainly seem that we are seeing the revelation, not least through consequence, of much that had previously been concealed, albeit sometimes in plain sight. This again is hardly unprecedented. It often takes a crisis to help us realize which of our ideas and orthodoxies are in fact fair weather ones and unfit for the purpose of aiding us as a society when we face up to and try and face down our collective problems and challenges. And so what is the solution if we are to inoculate ourselves as a society against the excesses of scientism in society? It would seem to me that the most useful thing we might do going forward is educate ourselves to think more rigorously in the face of ideological contagions, or narrow and reductive thinking, or the presumption, most of all, that science isn't just a tool to be used in the service of our values, but can instead be a guide to what our values should be. If the apocalyptic revelations of the pandemic can lead to this, we might avert some future cataclysmic apocalypses after all. Thank you very much.